The gospel taught by the modern-day Christian church that Jesus came to be a blood sacrifice for the sin of the world, that our sins have angered God and God requires blood. Sin cannot be forgiven without a blood sacrifice. This is actually the exact opposite of what Jesus taught. The actual message of Jesus would be considered heresy and is considered heresy today. If you are somebody who cares at all about following or understanding the true message of Jesus, then it is of paramount importance that you know the information that I'm going to provide in this video. This is perhaps the biggest cover-up in the history of humanity. I'm going to take you through history and show you through several sources, including the Moses Scroll, the Old Testament of the Bible, Dolores Cannon's accounts of the Essenes, and the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, that the true gospel of Jesus, or the true message of Jesus, would be considered heretical by the modern day church, which would in fact explain why it appears the early Catholic Church did their absolute best to wipe out anything and everything to do with the early Jewish Christian movement. This means that Jesus' original gospel may have been lost to time and is only now beginning to resurface. We're going to start with the book of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 31:24, we are told that Moses wrote down the words of this law, or the teaching of this Torah. After Moses finished writing in a book the words of this law, or the teaching of this Torah, from beginning to end, he gave this command to the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. Take this book of the law and place it beside the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God. When most Christians read this verse, they assume it is a reference to the entire Pentateuch from Genesis to Deuteronomy, because in modern Christian thought, Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. This is historically unlikely, and one of the reasons that we know this is because most of the Pentateuch is written in third person about Moses. Some of the passages are written from the perspective of a future point in time, looking back on what happened during Moses' lifetime with knowledge of future events that Moses would not have had. Also, there are multiple documents written from different perspectives that scholars call J, P, E, and D for Jehovah, Elohim, priestly, and I don't remember what D stands for right now, but these different narratives are all woven together. However, we do know that Moses did write something down, because there are several references in the Old Testament of the Bible to Moses writing down the law that was given to him by God at Sinai, or the teaching of the Torah. The question then becomes, what was in Moses' original writing? Because that is going to be the most pure and unadulterated version of the divine revelation that became the Judeo-Christian movement as we know it today. In 2 Kings, and I believe 2 Chronicles, we have the story of Hilkiah the high priest during the reign of King Josiah in Judah, the smaller of the 2 kingdoms of Israel, in the 600s BCE, rediscovering the book of the law, or the teachings of the Torah, that had been written by Moses. Apparently, it had been lost for a long time, and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were not following it. According to the narrative, when King Josiah discovered this, he was shocked and appalled. He tore his robes, as they did in the old days, as a sign of mourning. And then he instituted massive religious and social reform. 2 Kings 22, 8 through 13. Then Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the secretary, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. And they read it out loud in the hearing of the whole nation, I believe, and then they instituted massive reform. Of course, the important question becomes, again, what was in this book of the law? We can draw some conclusions based on Josiah's reforms about what would have been in the scroll that he discovered. He instituted monotheism, centralized worship in Jerusalem, which would have cut out most of the animal sacrifice that was happening around the country. He banned child sacrifice. He got rid of all the high places and Asherah poles, places where cultic worship was happening, which included sex slavery and a lot of very unsavory things were happening at these locations. Many scholars believe that what he found was a Proto-Deuteronomic text. I will say here that at this time we have no solid historical evidence of what exactly was in that scroll, but I recently made a book that makes some really interesting connections. I read the Moses Scroll by Ross Nichols. I can't show you the book because I actually have it in Audible, and I speed listened to it in 2 days. It was so interesting. It tells the fascinating story of a Proto-Deuteronomic text called the Moses Scroll that was allegedly discovered by Bedouins in a cave near the Dead Sea, which is in the region of Moab or modern-day Jordan. It was acquired by Moses Shapira in 1878, and he presented it to the world in 1883. Moses Shapira, a Jerusalem-based antiquities dealer, was convinced that it was genuine. However, it was determined to be a fake back in the 19th century for these reasons. Moses Shapira had previously been in a scandal involving other Moabite forgeries. They thought there was no way that this manuscript could have survived thousands of years in a damp cave. The letter forms look similar to what we see in another Moabite inscription, the Mesha stone, discovered in 1868, and those letter forms had never been seen on scrolls before, but only on this stone. So they assumed that the Moses scroll had been forged by someone who was familiar with the stone. Certain elements of the scroll, such as the fact that it was written in Paleo-Hebrew, it contained interpuncts, and it had words split at the end of the line, had never been seen on leather documents, but had been seen on the Mesha stone. So again, they thought that somebody had copied the Mesha stone and forged the Moses scroll. However, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls between 1946 and 1956 by Bedouins in caves near the Dead Sea almost a century later brought all of these arguments into question. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which are undeniably genuine, had survived in the same climate in caves near the Dead Sea. Several copies of the Pentateuch, as well as non-biblical texts, had been written in Paleo-Hebrew, and they also contained interpuncts and words split at the end of the line. So actually all of these original arguments against the Moses Scroll's validity ended up being evidence towards its authenticity, because nobody in the 19th century had ever discovered leather documents written in this way. They couldn't and wouldn't have forged a document using Paleo-Hebrew and interpuncts, because they had never found such a document and didn't know that it would one day be discovered. Ross Nichols, in his book entitled The Moses Scroll, argues that we need to reevaluate the authenticity of the Moses Scroll. I'm not a scholar, but based on the evidence that he's presented in his book, if you hear noise, it's my cat. It's always my cat when you hear noise. Come here. Come here. They want to see you. Come here. Ross Nichols also presents compelling evidence that the Moses Scroll, or a document similar to it, could have been the scroll that was discovered by the high priest Hilkiah. Of course, this is conjecture. With thousands of years between the life of Moses, if indeed he was a historical person, and the discovery of the Moses Scroll, it's pretty much impossible to think that the original law given at Mount Sinai would have been preserved in its purest form so many thousands of years later. There could have been thousands of variants of that original teaching by that point. But I do think it's likely that the Moses Scroll is the oldest version of a Proto-Deuteronomic text that we have discovered, and is probably a lot closer to the scroll that Josiah found than our Bible is today. So then, of course, the important question remains, what is in the Moses Scroll? And if you want to know for yourself, you can get Ross Nichols' book, because in chapter 21, he includes a translation of the Moses Scroll, but I will tell you what's in it. It contains a short accounting of Israel's journey from Mount Horeb into Canaan, followed by the Shema, the Ten Commandments, the curses for those who break the Ten Commandments, and the blessings for those who do follow the commandments. So 5 things: the short historical narrative, the Shema, the Ten Commandments, the curses, and the blessings. The Shema, for anyone who isn't familiar, as stated in the Moses Scroll, is, "Hear, O Israel, God our God is one." And this is an interesting difference. In our Bible, it says the Lord our God, or Yahweh our Elohim. And in the Moses Scroll, it says God our God, or Elohim our Elohim, which indicates that this version of the text was written before the Yahweh narrative was added, which is another argument towards it being a version of an early document. But the Shema in the Moses Scroll says, "Hear, O Israel, God our God, God is one, and you shall love God your God with all of your heart and all of your soul." I'm also going to read to you the Ten Commandments as listed in the Moses Scroll, because they are slightly different than what we have in our Bible. Number 1, there shall not be to you any other God. You shall not make for yourself any carved thing. Number 2, sanctify the 7th day. Number 3, honor your father and your mother. Number 4, you shall not kill the soul of your brother. Number 5, you shall not commit adultery with the woman of your neighbor. Number 6, you shall not steal the property of your brother. Number 7, you shall not swear by my name to deceive. Number 8, you shall not respond against your brother with a testimony of deceit. Number 9, you shall not desire anything that is your neighbor's. And number 10, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. So you'll notice that that 10th commandment is not included in our Bibles today. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. Could this be why in the New Testament, Jesus, who is correcting their interpretation of the Torah, says it's not good enough to just not murder your brother, but if you're angry at your brother in your heart, you're actually guilty of breaking the 8th commandment, you shall not murder. So we've gone over what the Moses Scroll does contain. Here's what the Moses Scroll does not contain that is included in our version of Deuteronomy. A, any mention of animal sacrifice, and B, the Levitical laws. It simply contains the greatest commandment given by Jesus in the New Testament: love God and love your neighbor. And all the 10 commandments fall under one of those 2 headings: the curses or the karma that will befall those who don't do these things, and the blessings or karma that will befall those who do follow these commandments. Is it possible that the original law given to Moses at Mount Sinai had to do with the greatest commandment in its purest form? God is one, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Could it be that animal sacrifice was not part of this original divine revelation? That it was an interpolation, something that the Israelites may have picked up from surrounding countries and integrated into their religion? Could this be why in the New Testament we see Jesus correcting the Old Testament teachings over and over and over? You have heard it was said, but I say, and making the bold claim that the entire law and the prophets, or the entire Torah and prophetic books, which was the entirety of the biblical text that they had up to that time. So that was their Bible. So their entire Bible could be summed up with one commandment: God is one, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. The Old Testament prophets seem to think so. And there's multiple examples that I could give here. The most astounding claim is made by the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah 8:8. He goes so far as to say that the Torah had indeed been changed. How can you say we are wise, for we have the law of the Lord, when actually the lying pen of the scribes has handled it falsely? The wise will be put to shame. They will be dismayed and trapped, since they have rejected the word of the Lord. What kind of wisdom do they have? It's basically saying, by following your version of the Bible, your version of the law of the Lord, you've actually rejected the true law of the Lord. But what exactly were they doing? What exactly was Jeremiah calling out? Well, chapter 7 goes into a lot of detail. So bear with me because I'm going to read through it here, and this is really important. Add your burnt offerings to your sacrifices and eat flesh. For I did not speak to your fathers or command them in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. But this is what I commanded them, saying, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. And you will walk in all the way which I command you, that it may be well with you. So basically saying, I don't want your burnt offerings. You take them and eat them. I have no use for them. I never asked you to offer sacrifices to me. I asked you to follow my commandments. The 10 Commandments, perhaps, that we read in the Moses scroll. For the sons of Judah have done that which is evil in my sight, declares the Lord. They have set their detestable things in the house, which is called by my name, to defile it. Well, which detestable things? Obviously, what they're bringing into the house or the temple are the sacrifices that God says he never asked for. But then it continues. They have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, which I did not command, and it did not come into my mind. So here God is condemning both animal and human sacrifices. And then earlier in the chapter, he also says, do not trust in deceptive words saying, this is the temple of the Lord. For if you truly amend your ways and your deeds, if you truly practice justice between a man and his neighbor, if you do not oppress the alien, the orphan, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, nor walk after other gods to your own ruin. So what innocent blood is being shed in this place, in the temple of the Lord? Animal sacrifices. Behold, you are trusting in deceptive words to no avail. Will you steal, murder, and commit adultery and swear falsely? Hitting all the 10 commandments there, right? And offer sacrifices to Baal and walk after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered, that you may do all of these abominations? Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? And this is the passage that Jesus quotes in Mark. And he began to teach and say to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a robber's den. This is the event, according to Mark, that directly led to Jesus' crucifixion. In verse 18, the chief priests and the scribes heard this and began seeking how to destroy him. So it seems like both the prophet Jeremiah and Jesus are saying the same thing. You think you're following the law of the Lord because you come to the temple with these blood sacrifices. Not only did I not want or command blood sacrifice when I gave you the law at Mount Sinai, you're also doing all of these other things that I directly commanded against. Stealing, murdering, not taking care of the poor, bearing false witness, etc. You're missing the entire point. The point of the law is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Very basic commandments. Don't steal, don't murder, don't offer your children as sacrifices, don't offer animals as sacrifices. Treat each other as you would want to be treated, basically, right? Love each other. That's what God has commanded. I mean, is it just me, or are you guys seeing this in the text as well? It seems to be pretty obvious. Now let's jump forward in time to a couple centuries before the life of Jesus. The Qumran community, called the Essenes by the historical writers, were a Jewish sect that emerged and deviated from Judaism in the 2nd century BCE. Much of our information on them comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in caves near Qumran along the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenian community actually refers to themselves as the Congregation of the Poor, or the Congregation of the Ebionim. The Dead Sea Scrolls don't use the word Essene, but for some reason the historical writers refer to them as Essenes. Besides the Dead Sea Scrolls, we also have archaeological evidence, and the historians I just mentioned who wrote about them, Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder. Here's what we know about them from these 3 historical sources. And I'd love to give quotes for all of this stuff, but we'll have to save that for another video because this one's just really full already. They practiced communal living. They abhorred animal sacrifices. They practiced water immersion for purification, or a form of baptism. They were highly mystical. They possessed their own version of the Torah, which differed from the mainstream, and they practiced strict observance of the Torah. We don't know the full extent of the texts that they had, but we do know that they absolutely interpreted their version of the Torah through an anti-sacrifice lens. They were appalled at the bloodshed that was happening in the temple. Here I want to bring in another interesting perspective, that of Dolores Cannon, pioneer in the field of past and between life regression, and one of the only voices that I trust on this subject. I do not take past life regressions as historical evidence, but I do have a high amount of trust in Dolores Cannon's work, as she was highly professional and meticulous. I've shared before that Dolores Cannon regressed a few people who had past lives with Jesus. The first of these was a young woman who recalled a past life in the time of Jesus as an Essenes teacher in the community of Qumran. This person taught Jesus the Torah as a child, and John the Baptist as well. There's a whole series of videos that we could and probably will do on this topic, because so much is revealed about the life of Jesus. But what I want to focus on here is the information provided about the Qumran community in this regression account. Dolores Cannon states in her book that she knew nothing about the Essenes except that they were a group shrouded in mystery, and she didn't even know what the word Qumran meant when she began this regression. She knew that the Dead Sea Scrolls had been discovered, but at the time that she was doing this regression and then later doing research for her book, they hadn't been released to the public. She writes in her book about how she remembers the frenzy surrounding their discovery and that she wondered why they had just disappeared. When she discovered that one of her clients had a past life as an Essene, she held off on any research until her book had been pretty much written. Then she researched the archaeological evidence that had been done up to that point and included some of it in her book. But she still didn't have access to the Dead Sea Scroll library that we have today, which confirms so many of her findings. According to Dolores, and I'm going to quote from one of her radio show programs, which I'll link in the description, the Essene community at Qumran was a secret school, a mystery school where all types of mysteries and knowledge were taught. They studied the law and the Torah, mathematics, astrology, astronomy, the mysteries, which included all kinds of esoteric and secret knowledge, including healing abilities. And she also shared that the highest level of knowledge that they taught at the Qumran school, and very few people attained this level, was how to raise the dead. According to Dolores Cannon and her interviews and her books, which I'll show here, these are the two books that she wrote with past life regression stories of people who had lived with Jesus. In this video, I'm sharing information from Jesus and the Essenes. According to this book, the Essenes were adamantly anti-sacrifice. They practiced communal living. Women were equal with men. They held deeply mystical beliefs and had a lot of esoteric knowledge, which they fiercely guarded. The Romans were afraid of them and wanted to wipe them out because they knew that their hidden knowledge, their esoteric knowledge, was very powerful. And so the Essenes had to stay hidden so they didn't get wiped off the face of the map. But of course, they had no intention of using this power to overthrow Rome. They were primarily trying to preserve it, to pass it on to other people, and teach it within the confines of their community. They believed that the original law of Moses was about love. They practiced a version of communion and water baptism. Here's an interesting quote from the book Jesus and the Essenes when Dolores asked the person under regression, and she's speaking to Sudi, the Qumranian teacher. I knew from the Old Testament that the Jews believed in animal sacrifices, but when I asked about this practice, he, Sudi, spoke emphatically against it. Sudi says, I do not sacrifice blood. Why would it be pleasing to God to kill something that he had created? This does not sound very logical. Dolores says, I thought you believed many of the same Jewish teachings, the Torah and the laws. Sudi says, they are part of belief, but are not the whole. Dolores says, but the Jews follow this practice of sacrifice, don't they? And Sudi responds, yes, from my understanding of this, these practices were borrowed from other religions, as you would call them. They were not something that were in the original teachings, but we do not sacrifice. We would place and burn incense on the altars and such things as this in a form of sacrifice. But this, referring to incense, would be the only thing. Although we currently have no historical evidence that Jesus came from the Essenian group or was associated with them, we know that Jesus' original followers called themselves the Ebionite, or the Congregation of the Poor. And we also know that the Dead Sea Scroll group, the Essenian group, called themselves the Congregation of the Poor, or the Congregation of the Ebionim. This is, again, a connection to explore on another day. The point here is that it's not a stretch to assume that these groups may have been in some way related, may have had similar beliefs. I personally think it is likely that Jesus emerged from an Essenian group or was connected to or related to them in some way, and that he had been taught a more authentic version of the Torah, likely similar to what we read in the Moses scroll, and probably one that did not include animal sacrifices. I want to take you now to another lost historical document called the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, or the Gospel according to the Hebrews, it's sometimes called. We find here a very interesting quote from Jesus that modern-day Christianity has tried very hard to discredit. So a little bit of background on this gospel. Most scholars today agree that neither of the four canonical gospels that we have were written by their namesakes or by anyone who actually knew Jesus. According to my understanding, it's only the fundamentalist Christian scholars and pastors who are coming to it with a preconceived idea that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, that then have to try to find a way to justify how these books could have actually been written by the disciples. But the scholarly evidence shows that they were in fact written decades after Jesus' life by Greek-speaking Gentile Christians. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not discounting them. I think that they're very valuable historical documents. We just have to keep in mind the time period that they were written in. Do they contain some of Jesus's original teachings? Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that some of his teachings were preserved in those writings. And in fact, that's where it becomes very interesting to look at things like the Jesus Seminar and the scholarly evidence that we do have to show which teachings were most likely to be authentic. But what if there was an earlier gospel? I mean, there had to have been something that was written down closer to Jesus's life by somebody who actually knew him. Several early Christian writers confirm that the disciple Matthew, who actually walked with Jesus, wrote a gospel in Hebrew or Aramaic. This gospel would have been highly accurate and contained Jesus's original teachings. We have tons of evidence that this Hebrew Gospel of Matthew was widely used by early Jewish Christian groups, the Nazarenes or the Ebionites. Here, I want to credit Aaron Apke and Cameron Waters for putting this information together in a way that makes it really easy to access these quotes. They've done a couple of full presentations on this, the most recent being their response video to the Wes Huff debate, which I will link in the description, where they lay all of this out in great detail. Aaron said that a lot of this evidence is coming from the book called The Hebrew Gospel and the Development of the Synoptic Tradition by James Edwards, so you can look this up if you want. But I'm just going to read a few of these quotes here. I'll put these quotes on the screen along with who said them and where they can be found in the writings of the early church fathers. Jerome writes, Matthew, also known as Levi, a tax collector who became an apostle, was the first in Judea to compose a gospel of Christ in Hebrew letters and words. From Origen of Alexandria, the first gospel was written according to Matthew, the same that was once a tax collector, but afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, who published it for those who came to faith from Judaism and composed it in the Hebrew dialect. From Hippolytus, Matthew, having written the gospel in Hebrew, published it in Jerusalem. From Epiphanius, they, the Nazarenes, have the gospel according to Matthew quite complete in Hebrew, for it is clear that they still preserve this as it was originally written in the Hebrew alphabet. From John Chrysostom, Matthew had first preached to Hebrews, and when he was on the point of going to others, he transmitted in writing in his native language the gospel according to himself. So we know that the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew existed and was used by the early Jewish Christian groups, whose writings were destroyed by the Catholic Church. And the only surviving fragments that we now have of this early gospel are preserved in the writings of the Church Fathers. The quotes that we have are very interesting and could be the topic of another entire video. But there is one particular quote from the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew that I want to bring to light today, and it's this one, quoted by Epiphanius. "I have come to abolish sacrifices, and if you do not cease from sacrificing, my wrath will not cease from you." In next week's video and the following videos, I plan to go into great detail on what Jesus' gospel or message actually did entail. But for now, I think that we can establish with some certainty that Jesus' gospel did not entail blood sacrifice. And so for today, I leave you with this question. If the original divine revelation that was given to the ancient Hebrews at Mount Sinai, the original teaching of the Torah wrote down by Moses, many of the Old Testament prophets like Isaiah, the Essenian groups who claim to have a more pure version of the Torah, and the earliest, most accurate account of Jesus' life and teachings that we have, all either do not include animal sacrifice or directly oppose it, then how did we end up where we are today, where Jesus is presented as the final blood sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins? Something does not add up. If Jesus himself was anti-sacrifice and did not come to be a blood sacrifice for the sin of the world, then what was his actual message? Check back next week as we go deeper into the rabbit hole and find out that the actual message that Jesus was teaching is considered heresy today. Thank you for watching and listening. If you would like to go deeper with me, you can join my community membership, Love Covered Life Sanctuary. Link is in the description. Now go live your most extravagantly loving life, and thank you for watching.